McKinley was from Champaign, the House of U.S. Representatives, and the U.S. Senate. And also, Mr. McKinley was very generous with his money, which we'll look at a little bit later on. But Mr. McKinley had his beginning right here in Champaign. He developed the Champaign Water Works. And from there, Mr. McKinley started expanding out his utility empire. And of course, he developed the Champaign Light Company. And he electrified the horse car streetcar line between Champaign and Urbana. And Mr. McKinley, of course, is now starting to grow and expand his empire. And Mr. McKinley in 1900 would go to Danville and he would buy the Danville streetcar and street and railway light company. But with this, Mr. McKinley had the powerhouse, which required coal. So he started building a railroad from Danville south to Westville to the coal fields to transport coal to his powerhouse. But also had they had a streetcar operation, streetcars would transport mine workers to Westville. And this was the beginning of development of the attraction. And Mr. McKinley would expand his westward expansion by buying the streetcar power houses in Champaign, Urbana, Decatur, Bloomington, Peoria. And what he would do is to build this empire was link interurbans between the two urbans. So what he would have, he could leave Danville, come to Urbana, operate on a streetcar line through Urbana, Champaign, then continue in interurban onto Decatur and of course so forth. One of their his people would go out to a farmer and say, we want to buy your land and build a railroad across it. Well, the farmers are kind of a little bit shy. Like if you go broke, like, get my land back, so they make agreements there. But he added one more thing to it, was the farmer's lane across the railroad track would become a station stop. That's why people could walk out to the lane, daytime, wave hands, train stop, pick them up. Nighttime, they had a lantern or roll of newspaper, and they would stop the train anyway, And of course, the crew knew these people, and they knew where they got on to all that. So that was really a unique transportation system. But the system was continued expanded. By 1910, would be a 550-mile empire. But as you see, Danville to Champaign opened on September 7, 1903, under Danville Urbana Champaign Railroad. And a year later, almost to the day, he's operating 34 trains a day between Champaign and Urbana. The interesting thing you notice, the local, you're only talking 34 miles between Champaign and Danville, but the local took an hour and 45 minutes to travel between the 2 points. So you think about that, an hour and 45 minutes, over 34 miles between Champaign and Danville. Back then, that was really a big time to take a travel like this. And of course, with the IT, Mr. McKinley, his hallmark was he wants quality, he wants the best for everybody. So as you can see, when you rode on the IT, you rode in style. And not only was equipment, but the buildings. And this was he considered a showcase station at Georgetown, which was being built south of Danville. As you can see, the train comes through, but upstairs was the band loft. On Saturday nights, the municipal band would go up on loft, the citizens would park around the city streets, and they listen to band play. And the last tune they played would be Carolina Moon, would be the closing song. But also, Mr. McKinley is expanding this railroad westward, and he's reaching East St. Louis. So on January 1st, 1908, he now has got 8 hours and 40 minutes to travel time to go between Champaign and St. Louis. Of course, back then, what'd you have, a horseback, stagecoach? They couldn't compete with a railroad like this. And the crowning achievement in 1910, Mr. McKinley bridged the Mississippi Railroad, and he brought his railroad into downtown St. Louis. And of course, the interesting thing about this bridge was that Mr. McKinley built it to the highest standard possible. If you notice, the other competing railroad lines, the East and Merchant Bridge was rated at 3,500 pounds per linear foot. The McKinley Bridge is 5,000. So he built something, he built it to last. And of course, that bridge still exists this day. And of course, the rest is new. Kind of interesting piece of history. This is February 11th, 1911. Howard Taft is president. Interesting, Mr. McKinley is in the House of Representatives, but he's also Mr. Taft's campaign manager. So he tells President Taft, in Springfield, they're having a dinner honoring Lincoln's birthday, and we'd like you to come and attend. So Mr. Taft did accompany him and come to Decatur, boarded the train, and rode the train across to Springfield. And the interesting thing, too, is this gentleman here, H.E. Chubbuck, wearing a straw hat. Mr. Chubbuck was an interesting individual. Now remember, Mr. McKinley is in the House of Representatives, and during his term there, his empire is being built, but it's being built under the eye of Mr. Chubbuck. And again, Mr. Chubbuck, this gentleman here, when it comes to perfection, he wanted everything to be just right. He would spend several thousand miles a year riding his private car over the railroad. And of course, his thing was, if I sleep in complete comfort at night, traveling by rail, I know my passenger travel as well. I kind of have a note here. I've had people say this police officer here looks a lot like me in one of the but behind him, that looks like Laurel and Hardy there. Now, of course, development of the railroad, you have to have passengers. And of course, he had a pretty open market back then. He's building this railroad, he's providing a service that just literally door to door, so to speak. And of course, to also attract more passengers, he would develop amusement parks along the different locations of the line. The case being Homer Park, which opened in 1925. So you're here in Champaign, it's summertime. You know, you think back in 1925, you didn't. Radio, I guess, is still in its infancy. So there's people who go and go someplace to do something, you own an attraction, let's go to the amusement park. And that's one of the things to contribute to. We kind of transition into some of the aspects of the railroad. Mr. McKinley was a gentleman, had a vision, and always looked forward to what can I do better? What can I serve the public with? Well, he would have the distinction of being the first electric railroad to operate sleeping car service. And sleeping car service was operated between Decatur and East St. Louis. And had two cars, one car leave Decatur, one leave East St. Louis, and they passed in the night. And this, as you can see, during the daytime, the curtains would raise up, the bed would raise up, the seats would unfold back into regular seating and used for a product car during the daytime. And then, of course, night converted to sleeping. This was successful, but the only problem was you get this night's sleep, but you hear the noise of the air compressor, you hear the clanging of gears, you hear the clanging of the rail, and just kind of small irritations. And Mr. McKinley said, we can do better than this. Mr. Chubbuck, what can you do about this? Mr. Chubbuck designed a set of sleeping cars, trailers pulled by a motor. So this way you don't have the sounds and noises from a motor car. But the things he enhanced, windows for the upper berth. Pullman Standard didn't have that. The berth was 6 inches longer than a standard Pullman berth. So if you was 6'2", you had a little bit of room to stretch out. Pullman, not quite. And then of course in the morning, the porter would greet you with a roll and a cup of coffee. He had a hot plate that he'd everything up on. Of course, he got electricity. So he would serve rolls and coffee in the morning and no tipping. Now, of course, this took care of the traveling public for a sleeping car service. He also catered to the businessman. And so 1911, between Danville and Springfield to St. Louis, for 2 years, he operated a car between Danville and St. Louis. And again, the businessman would travel in luxury. Honduras mahogany interiors, wood inlay stripping, polished brass, stained glass windows, and of course, courteous attendants to wait on every need you want. So if you as a businessman, you travel in luxury when you rode the old attraction. And like I say though, unfortunately, this one lasted for 2 years, and then the service was cut back finally between Peoria and St. Louis. But still, it offered a unique opportunity for a person traveling. And we talk about it right here in Champaign. When Mr. McKinley is building this empire, he's building the different locations at different times. So he's got people scattered throughout this system, for all like the superintendents in Peoria. The head of the right-of-way track work is in Springfield. So you got all these officers scattered throughout the railroad. So now he needs to bring everybody under the same roof, which introduced our passenger station, which is just right down the street of the city block, is the office building and also the passenger station for the ITS. And of course, if you're in Urbana, 120 Main Street was where the passenger station is located there. We talk a little bit about passenger. Let's talk a little bit about freight service. 1930s, you know, the Depression hits. A lot of small railroads, especially interurbans, went bankrupt because they was depending on the passenger service. And passenger service during the Depression could not sustain a railroad, and they was going broke and bankrupt. But because of Mr. McKinley's foresight to develop freight traffic as early as 1910, he was competing with the steam railroads. And because he's competing with steam railroads, he's also able to survive the Depression era. But to give an example of some of his wisdom, this area is called the Corn Belt because of the massive amount of corn being built in this growing area. Mr. McKinley had the foresight to build the grain elevator on his railroad. So now Mr. McKinley is making revenue from the farmers bringing the grain in to the elevator, and now he's also developing his own traffic to move the grain to the market. So this was the Farmers Elevator Association, so throughout the system, you see these other grain elevators being built by the one traction. And of course now, we're talking about moving freight, we can have a locomotive move freight. And so in his Decatur shops, Bill Williams was the chief mechanical officer. And Bill was also, one of genius. And this man designed and built these freight motors right there in Decatur shops. And this is a Class B locomotive. Could pull about 18 cars. Top speed about 30 miles an hour. But back then, this was really a high standard for this railroad. But I introduced you also to the auxiliary car. The IT, of course, remember, think about this now, your trackage through city streets with streetcar trackage, and of course the IT is traveling over this trackage or owns it. And you got an opera house in every small town. The IT would serve, let's say right here in Champaign, you had an opera house. And of course you had a circuit where Vaudeville would travel. And they have these 50-foot oak poles that from that pole hung a backdrop scene. So now you're in Vaudeville, and you're going to go from Bloomington to Champaign for the next program. So of course, in the middle of the night, they park this rail car in front of the Opera House. They take this 50-foot pole and put it inside this rail car. Now remember, the doorway is only 10 foot wide. How do you get a 50-foot pole in there? Because the pole's solid, so don't bend. The doorway's only 10 foot wide. How do you get that pole in there? Again, the genius of the people that helped Mr. McKinley build his railroad. And I was talking about freight being developed. Of course, more freight being developed needed stronger, more engine. So they built out of the Decatur shops. They built the Class C locomotive. But interesting feature to give you an idea what life was like in the 1920s. You're the motorman. You're standing there behind that glass, and this here cutaway here is this right here. Okay. So what that is, that's called the clear vision window. So you're the motorman, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're driving down through the hollers, and it's starting to spit that sleet, cold rain. Well, you notice There's no windshield wiper on this window, just the clear vision was hinged. So the motorman had to open the window to get a clear vision. But all of his elements come right back at him. And talk about Mr. McKinley being a statesman. This gentleman was very interesting. He was 1905 to 1912, and then of course from 1915, 1921, he served the House of Representatives. In 1921, they was promoting the idea of him running for governor. But Mr. McKinley said, no, I'd like to stay where I do the most good, and he became a senator in 1921. Well, the 1926 election rolls around, and it was, if you had dirty politics now, you really had some classic dirty politics back then. So that may introduce you to Mr. Colonel Frank Smith. Mr. Smith is the head of the Illinois Commerce Commission. The Illinois Commerce Commission regulates railroads, streetcar operations, things like this nature. Now, to kind of bring us together, let me introduce you to Ms. Samuel Stencil. You've heard of Commonwealth Edison up in Chicago, like the only powers here is Commonwealth Edison in Chicago. They have Samuel Edison. And Samuel did not like Mr. McKinley. Matter of fact, he flat out hated him. And he wanted Mr. McKinley's empire. So, Mr. McKinley is up for re-election. Mr. Insel is going back, Colonel Smith, to run against Mr. McKinley. And he's pumped a lot of money into it, dirty campaign. And it got so bad that the U.S. Senate got involved in an investigation. Well, the smoke cleared, the dirty politics played out, and Colonel Smith won. But the Senate would not seat him as a senator from Illinois because of the dirty politics he's involved in. But unfortunately, Mr. McKinley was being suffering from prostate cancer. And the stress of the selection compounded the problem. He would die on December 7, 1926. Mr. McKinley is buried here at Hope Cemetery in Urbana, and on his chest is the French Legion of Honor Medal for his efforts towards world peace. Mr. McKinley was a very active individual for world peace. But Mr. McKinley, he's passed away, but he left behind quite a legacy. He left behind several buildings, just like right now the McKinley Memorial Hospital. The McKinley Hall was now called Tubble Hall. Chanute Airfield ran two. He was responsible for getting them filled. The Champaign athletic fields, he paid for those. And they had the working girls in Chicago, a nursery for the working mothers, and a lodge for day nurses in Chicago. And this is just some of the things that Mr. McKinley had built and donated. We're talking about finances. Now, remember, Mr. McKinley has got an empire of railroads, but he also, in Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Wisconsin, he owns several utilities in those locations. So the man is extremely wealthy. And like they said, Mr. McKinley possessed the ability to not only make money, was only exceeded by his ability to give it away. So as you can see here, some of the things that Mr. McKinley had donated the money from. And I put the dollars amount, what the donation was, versus what it would be valued in 2022. So you can see here, $10 million to just ordinary people. You remember the television show years ago called The Millionaire? And Mr. Michael would knock on the door. I had this check. He would do things like this. He would find out somebody has got a difficult time, and he would send money to that individual. The person never knew where it was going to come from, but was to help them get along. And that's just how Mr. McKinley was, a very generous man. And as they say here, $10 million, they valued $323 million. I just can't imagine somebody's got $300 million and won't give anybody money like this. This poster you see here, in 1924, it's called the Kaufman Award. There's a competition across the country with all electric railroads, and they would submit a book touting why their railroad was the best railroad in the country. Well, one of the things they had was they created these advertising posters. But ironically, as nice as these posters were, they was never really public. So what you've seen here is something that's never been printed until now. I can regress a little bit. Mr. McKinley, in 1923, is, of course, now is a U.S. Senator. And you know how everybody kind of looks at the gasoline companies with kind of an eye, like, you know, I don't trust you. Utilities back then was the same way. I don't trust you. You know, you're something about you. So Mr. McKinley had to divest himself away from his empire. Now, of course, he's not going to give it up, but he had to put it into a trust. To do this, he merged his railroad with this Clement Studebaker. Studebaker from South Bend, Indiana, fame with the automobile. They owned the Southern Illinois Railway and Light Company down in Southern Illinois. So the two companies were merged, and they created Illinois Power and Light Company, which nowadays is Illinois Power. Then, of course, if you think about it, they had a powerhouse in Danville, a powerhouse in Peoria, one in Riverton, and one in Venice, Illinois. And this fed a 33,000 volt line parallel to the railroad, and every so far they had drops or substations for the train operations. But you got these small burgs, 500,000, maybe 2,000. They can't afford a powerhouse. But Mr. McKinley made a power drop in these small burgs. So this town has got power, next town over doesn't. But that's how the Illinois Power and Light become in existence. But Mr. McKinley has now expanded his railroad empire. Freight is really becoming the mainstay of finances for this railroad. So with this, Mr. McKinley would acquire 3 steam railroads in the East St. Louis area to connect with his electric railroads going up towards Peoria, up towards Danville, Springfield. And also he would acquire a high-speed suburban service. So you might say the Illinois Terminal had it all. Had a steam railroad, had the commuter service between St. Louis and Alton. He had a rail bus between Alton and Grafton, Illinois, and he even had a bus operation. So Mr. McKinley, when he built something, he built it with flair. Now, some of you, if people grew up with the Illinois Terminal, they remember the cars being maybe green, but they distinctly remember being orange. And the original color of the cars were green, but we entered the orange car era. And what happened in 1924, they're looking at this city, looking at the overall map of the railroad and the competition against railroad automobile. There's 1924, there's 890 miles of paved highway now in Illinois. Up until now, it was just a dirt lane with a wooden sign telling you to turn here, turn there. So now the highways are coming into effect. 950,000 automobiles were registered in Illinois in 1924. And the revenue is declining by $340,000 because of this indent of arrival of the automobile. So now the railroad is looking at, we've got to do something about improving the operations. Of course, Mr. McKinley has passed away, and so we're looking at personnel trying to come up with something. So in 1927, they introduced what we call the orange car era. And what they've done, they took 6 passenger cars, they painted tangerine orange and called them tangerine flyers. They increased the speed between St. Louis and Champaign to a 6-hour running time. And they took the cross seats out and put car seats in. So now you can ride on this car that's really luxurious with a parlor car seat. You're not paying extra for that seat, and you're at a higher speed. And it was very successful, but my problem was you limited the number of people that you could put in that car. So 2 years later, they realized that maybe this is not a good idea, so they took the parlor car seats out and put the cross seating back in again and painted all the cars orange to disassociate that plant from tangerine flyers. But simultaneously, they're also introducing sleeping car service here in Champaign. So now you go down the station, you would board the car behind the station. You could board the car at 8 o'clock at night. Of course, the cars were air conditioned. And the next morning you wake up, you'd be in St. Louis, and you can stay in the car till 10 o'clock that morning. I can't imagine a sleeping car, getting on a sleeping car and go to St. Louis. It just, you'll be there in 3 hours.
Yeah.
Now, the traffic congestion, the automobile is starting to take its toll on the railroad. And of course, we operate on the city streets, as we hear in Champaign. And this building, I think is right here, that's your city hall under construction. So you can see the congestion the IT is faced with automobiles here in Champaign. And of course, Champaign is saying, you know, how about getting the railroad off our streets? Because they give the railroad permission to operate on the streets. They give it, they take it away. And of course, in this case, they wanted this railroad off the streets because of the traffic congestion. So in answer to this, what they've done is they electrified the Illinois Central Railroad between Staley's to State Street, and then State Street, they made it connect with the Wabash, electrified the Wabash all the way down to Main Street there in Urbana. So now you've got the electric railroad operating on steam railroad, building around the city. And of course, they got off the city streets. And with this, they would utilize the Champaign station for the Wabash. And of course, they'd utilize the Urbana station for the Wabash station. But now, of course, downtown, they had the freight traffic, the cargo merchandise. So with that, they built a new freight house just on North Neal Street. So now, railroad is now built around the city, and all the freight traffic that you would pick up on was on North Neal. Matter of fact, IT had a slogan: if you call your supplier in St. Louis and it's on our dock at 6 o'clock at night, I'll have it at your door, or it'd be at our door at 6 o'clock the next morning. You know, where can you get service like that? And of course, they also had the Illinois Terminal Express Company, which, like UPS, would deliver, and it was from your door to our door. And of course, the poster. Now, in 1945, we're going through World War II, and the equipment is literally getting the real wheels run off of it. Over there at Illinois, they built a massive ordnance plant, so the Illinois Terminal would operate ordnance trains from Springfield to Decatur, and this equipment would haul workers to the ordnance plant and turn them all back. But as you think back then, tires were hard to come by, gas is being rationed, so the traction was obviously the easy choice to get there and back. So we come out of the war, you got this equipment pretty well worn, and the railroad's looking at the passenger service, and they made the judgment, we're going to make one last effort to take and try to capture passenger service. And with that, they introduced the Streamliner in 1948. And of course, this was, in 1948, this was the most modern luxury that you could travel with. Air conditioned, reclining seats, big windows, and for the first time, you can actually travel, transfer from one rail car to another. Because on the old equipment, they had no way that you could step across. And of course, now you can go back to the dining car and enjoy a meal, something to drink, maybe play cards, but you had complete luxury. And thus, the equipment is now painted blue, being a blue car. So if some of you folks might remember the orange car, you remember what it was blue cars. This is why they painted the equipment to match the Streamliners. But unfortunately, passenger service has become a bottom line red. They're losing money pretty bad with passenger service. Everybody's got an automobile. They don't depend on the on the tracks to go for a ride. So now the Illinois Terminal is looking at abandoning the passenger service between Danville and DeLong. DeLong was just a little green elevator right out there on Route 10, right there at the intersection of Route 49, and a little station at the top called Watkins. So now the IT is going to petition and say, we're losing money operating between these 2 points, between Danville and DeLong. Now, of course, DeLong is a freight elevator, so they want to keep that track in place to serve that green elevator for the freight revenue. So with this, On April 26, 52, they would abandon 6 trains between Danville and DeLong. But now you think about it, we're talking about Long and Champaign. How many really big metropolitan cities do you have between the 2 points? Ogden, St. Joe. So at this, the IT is now operating 6 trains between these 2 points. And of course, that's really now losing money, so now they filed to abandon the operation. They filed and abandoned, and then back to 26, 1952, they was able to discontinue between Watkins and Danville. So now we've got this car operating between these 2 points. Well, the interesting thing, if you notice on this rail car, it's got a tripod in the front of the car. So now they got to protect these schedules between Watkins and Danville, or between Watkins and Champaign. So the car would go to Ogden, would take and go into the Y, and then back up and run backwards from Ogden to DeLong. And of course, this service only lasted a short time, because losing money. So then on the April 28th, which is next Thursday, week of the day, 69 years to the date, they discontinued the service between Watkins and Champaign. As you see here, he's backed up. You can see they have to have a headlight for the backup move, the hose for the conductor, and of course the tripod. Now we talk about passenger service east of Champaign Basin. Now we have to look at going west side of Champaign, going to Springfield. Same problem again. We were operating 6 trains, and the railroad said we're losing money. We wanted to abandon all 6 trains. The Illinois Commerce Commission was back and said, no, you can't do that. It's too harsh. So what we're going to do, you're going to put on 2 test trains, one each way between Decatur and Champaign, and see how that does. So that was effective on March 13, 55. But unfortunately, on June the 12th of 55, it proved that it was unsuccessful, and passenger service was ceased to exist between Decatur or actually Springfield and Champaign. Of course, this last car and the crew with that train. Now the freight service, now passenger service has now been abandoned, but we continue to operate the freight service going to DeLong, Glover. They had a connection to C9 Railroad, and a couple grain elevators, Mayview, and a couple other places between here and DeLong that they would serve. So 1948, dieselization is coming to the Illinois terminal. Of course, dieselization, you got these steam locomotives, and they're very manpower extensive to maintain, to overhaul, very expensive. But a diesel is very, very easy to maintain, doesn't require a whole shop of people. Only need a few people to maintain a diesel locomotive. Diesels can go anywhere, where electric couldn't, diesel could. So it's 1948, they started banning steam locomotives. And in 1953, they acquired 6 of these locomotives and started dieselizing the electric railroad. So now as you see here, the freight train is holding the main line, the passenger train is going inside. That kind of tells you what they think about that passenger train. So by 1955, the wire comes down, and diesel now takes care of handling all the freight service between Decatur and DeLong, and of course the electrics are retired. And of course the passenger service was finally come to an end between Springfield and St. Louis on March 3rd, 1956. This is the last car out of Springfield going to St. Louis, the last passenger service to operate on the Illinois terminal. Some remnants that remained after the IT Van Electric was the powerhouse here at Champaign, maintained a rotary converter to operate power, to operate this little switch engine to do the switch of coal in and out of the plant, the power plant. The freight house, it no longer was servicing the IT, it was torn down, and your new post office was built in its place. So where your post office is on North Neal Street, that's what was there before. And of course, the IT took some interesting turns in the late 50s, early 60s. The only terminal was operating okay, the only McKinley Bridge, but kind of the oddball thing of this was the Santa Fe Railroad was looking at the Illinois terminal. They wanted to buy the Illinois terminal because they wanted to do the St. Louis market. Now, the IT interchange was with the Santa Fe at Morton, and they owned the bridge across the Mississippi Railroad, or Mississippi River. Now, mind you, the Illinois terminal owned that bridge, which means that if they own that bridge, they can run any railroads and trains they want across that bridge. Well, the 11 railroads in the St. Louis area said, you know, we don't want that competition from Santa Fe. We don't want them up the market. So they could band together, and they bought the Illinois terminal and took control of the Illinois terminal to block the Santa Fe acquiring that railroad. But this would lead also to consequences of the Illinois terminal. They'll start abandoning Illinois terminal tractors in favor of paralleling railroads, owner railroads. And the case here being May 1st, 1961, between Champaign, Urbana, and Fifth and DeLong, they abandoned their main line and favored operator PO on the Eastern Railroad, which was one of the owners of IT. And of course, a lot of railroad tracking was abandoned in favor of parallel railroads. Of course, IT there's a whole history that I could go into about the diesel era. But in 1968, the railroad was in a state of undeclared bankruptcy. And they owned 11 railroads. They were looking at the one terminal saying, this is liability. Let's disband, let's terminate the terminal. We'll sell off the equipment, we'll furlough the employees, and what traffic they have, we'll absorb the traffic. And the Illinois terminal in 1968 was supposed to die. But Mr. E.B. Wilson, president, he was with the Railroad, so on the board of directors of IT, said, let me take a shot at trying to save this railroad. I think I can save it. And he did. Brand new locomotives, new freight cars. And during the oil crisis back in the mid-70s, Mr. Wilson had this railroad so fine, well tuned, we was the second most profitable railroad in the United States. And that's during the oil embargo. But unfortunately, Mr. Wilson would have a heart attack. They brought in a new set of management, and actually the word management is incorrect. The word mismanagement is better suited. And they would literally bankrupt this railroad. And now the board of directors is looking at the Illinois terminal, and they're saying, you know, we're going to be settled this liability, let's get rid of the railroad. Well, Norfolk Western stood up and says, we'll buy the Illinois terminal, we'll buy your shares and take ownership. Of course, what they don't tell you is ADM is a big milling company in Decatur, and the IT ran a train every night, 100-car train down to the Alton docks that they owned, of soybean meal. Well, of course, the NW, where do they go? They go to Decatur, they go to St. Louis, same place. So that's why they wanted the IT, and they got the IT. So as you can see, the IT was purchased by the IT. So on May the 8th, 1982, the Illinois terminal ceased to exist. As myself, I was employed as the Illinois terminal special agent, and I ended up being absorbed in Norfolk Western. A year later, worked with Southern because Norfolk Southern Railroad, so I worked with them. In 2007, I retired with my 40 years of service with the railroad. And I'm also involved helping with this Line I Terminal Railroad, the Responic Railroad. Terry and I worked together on the Illinois Terminal back in the 70s. Terry left, started his own railroad company, asked me to help, so I'm a general superintendent overseeing 10 railroad operations in 3 states. And the thing is, I get to play the big trains. And of course, I represent the Illinois Traction Society. We're the historical society for the Illinois Terminal. Our goal is to preserve and present the history of the Illinois Terminal as a case as this. We put a color magazine out twice a year, and we put a newsletter out twice a year. And we have an annual meeting once a year, as you can see here, was in Grant City in 2010. So we're a very active rail fan group, and we invite you to join us. And you can find us on the internet at theillinoistractionsociety.org for more information. And leave it as parting thought, being a special agent, deal with railroad families. 1954, as you can see here, the railroad owns up the buildings. They're not worried about liability, about somebody getting hurt. Sure, come on and take pictures. We're glad to have you here. Go to 2022, no trespassing. Fence the place in. So keep in mind, rail fan, no exceptions, rail fan responsibility. And that's the story of the Illinois actions. Have you any questions? Anything I can guess, ma'am?
I'm curious. McKinley obviously had a love for the railroads, and he had these numerous luxury lines. Was there a way of transporting people who were more working class?
Yeah, it was working class. If you go back and you talk to some of the old timers, they went to school. They would climb on the IT and they'd take a car to go to school. A lot of people would, like in Peoria, they would go to work for Caterpillar. And of course they lived out outlying areas to take the IT to work. And I had some people tell me that that's how they met their wife. They would go on a train and meet their wife and for a date. So the IT is a very intricate part of their lives. And in the 50s and 40s, the IT was very well part of everybody's life. Yes, ma'am.
So does that mean there weren't sections of the train cars where some were more elaborate and plushier where some people sat, and then there was some that was like wood seats where others sat?
All your seats were very comfortable to start with. But the thing was, the parlor car, you had the coach, the standard coach, which was the comfortable. As a matter of fact, one of the seats is here on display. So you can see it's better than one seat. It's a comfortable seat. But you paid extra fare to go back in the parlor car, and there you would get the royal treatment, so to speak. Because you paid a little extra for it. And of course, you could have your favorite beverage served to you at your seat that you're sitting back there, looking out the back windows that rail disappears into the landscape. The dinner. The porter also doubled as the cook. So you order a steak dinner. You could have a steak dinner and you sit there and he would cook the meal up and everything you want. It's done just right. That's one thing about the IT. They had a standard that everything was of excellence. And anybody who worked there, they just come with a way of life. You didn't have anything different. Yes, sir.
So why did McKinley push the electric versus, because it would have been, the alternative was steam initially?
Well, but his start was in utilities.
So he had the power plant, so it was a connection for him.
Yes, and he had streetcars. All he done was he had a power plant, a streetcar in the Urbana-Champaign, had a power plant and streetcar in Decatur. So the interurban would connect the two streetcar lines together. So he could go through the town, out in the country to the next town. And of course, like I say, also, he's making these power drops for these small towns. So there was another way of making revenue. And then, of course, like I say, Mr. Chubbuck, he was a genius. Matter of fact, the interesting thing about Mr. Chubbuck, he comes from a family of electrical geniuses back in the 1900s. If you go to Fifth Inn, you'll see a IT substation, yellow brick substation. The interesting thing, there's 11 of them built on the railroad. But the interesting thing about those substations, they came to them in a dream. To design in a dream how to design them and how to make them. And as I understand, research, this was a family trait. They got several electrical patents for every piece of equipment back in the turn of the century. But a lot of stuff comes to them in a dream and they put it on paper. Fascinating people.
Now, I do recall reading in the News Gazette with the interurban that there were some auto crashes into the vehicles sometimes. So as cars were becoming more popular and these things were moving through town.
Well, that's true. And of course, the motorman that he had, he's sitting in that front window. I mean, his nose was right against that glass. And he's watching these cars, and of course, 6 miles an hour is the speed limit through towns when you're joining city streets like this. But it doesn't matter, you still have them people, like you do now, yeah, you know, they've got more, well, not more common sense, let's put it that way. And they turn in front of them, there's pictures where you see pictures where they hit the side of the train. There's an unfortunate incident in the Oleopolis, the highways back then. You got gentle curves now, but in Oleopolis you had two 90-degree turns. And actually, we're talking about a true 90-degree turn. And the family of 6, they pulled up they come around that curve and pulled right up on the track, and of course the whole family got killed. The interesting thing, and Mr. Harry was the superintendent for the only attraction in Decatur. And Mr. Harry was being chauffeured, and apparently was a very portly gentleman. And they say he come around, the chauffeur come around the curve just a little too fast, the door flew open, and he thought he got killed. So.
I think, you know, when you talk about making those curves, the picture you had in there of downtown Champaign, I think that was like a number 270, which was like one of the longest cars they ever produced. And you saw the wide berth it had to take just to make the turn from Neal Street onto Main Street. And you can imagine how that would tie up traffic. I mean, you take that very gently as you're getting around there, I would imagine.
But of course, people know here comes that car to stay out of his way.
Right.
The Bloomington was a good example. The curves through downtown Bloomington were so tight, a freight car could not stand. A freight car could not go around the curve. It was just too tight, and it would actually, the corners of the rail car would hit because the curve's so tight. So they had 10 box cars that they call expandable drawbars. And what they done, your coupler has got a shank goes in the body of the rail car. Well, they take one of that coupler, pull a pin out, pull that shank out about 6 or 8 foot, and put the pin back in. So now you have the more radius that you can make. Again, genius of the IT people.
So what were the fares like over the years?
You're talking like 2 cents a mile. You think 2 cents a mile, if you go back and look at some of the dollar amounts, Mr.
Right.
McKinley, you know, you say $10 million. So 2 cents, I'm going to guess might be equivalent to like 20 cents, something like that. So, you know, the fare was reasonable. Of course, like I said, of course, they had different rates too. They had specials on the weekend. They had excursion fares on the weekend where you got to pay for one-way, price one way, but get a round-trip ticket. A good example of that was there in Springfield down to Benel. Benel was a coal mining community, and the city was 3 blocks long. And it was all the taverns. I mean, this was all 3 blocks of taverns, and the cat houses were upstairs. They run excursion trains down to Benel on weekends, and they'd be full.
I think it's important to note that he would run excursions to his own properties as well, right? You mentioned Homer Park. There were
Right.
there were other places that he developed and
Smart.
getting people out to it, right? Creating the demand for himself. Yeah.
And of course, you had to have the lighting to light that whole thing up.
Yeah.
Come and supply the light.
Well, and you can learn a little bit more about the electrification of rural communities, which was another, you touched on that, that was another big piece of it, right? I mean, every cities wanted the traction to come to them because it often meant also the availability to start electrifying the small rural community as well.
When the railroad was being built, you had these communities vying with each other, trying to outdo each other. Come build the railroad here, we'll give you ground, or we'll give you a depot. And so, I mean, there was competition back then. But at the same time, this was the era of boom and bust. You had a lot of rails being chartered to be built. They might get a few miles built, go broke. And so, you know, a lot of people are a little bit leery from that standpoint of investing in, you know, selling their property to somebody not sure that you're going to get it back if they go broke. But again, Mr. McKinley would make agreements with, as a matter of fact, that's what's happened with the ban of the railroad. A lot of these people, like farmers, butt up against the right of way. Well, they find out that they can go back and find a deed and find that clause in that deed says that the property, if this railroad is abandoned, the property will revert back to the family that owns that property or the owners of that property. So a lot of people were able to get their property back then.
Yeah. You mentioned the steam, the difference between the two, and we touched on that in the exhibit downstairs about how important, and who, the question of who was writing, and it really was, it was a stitching together of central Illinois. This is really a story of rural and urban, where, people who lived in small towns could finally come to town, or even sell some of their produce and things in larger markets, and now you could throw your flag up on your farm property, this train would stop for you. You'd come into Champaign and do your shopping and watch a movie and go back in the same night. That was a transformative concept back then, because before that, I mean, you didn't have a car. You would have taken your horse. You would have been bogged down in some wet, marshy street. And so the Illinois traction system to me is really the story of how it connected all of these small towns. And steam might have stopped, maybe, if your town was lucky enough. Maybe steam stopped there, and the schedule might have been 1 or 2 times a day. But the traction might have been on an hour schedule, or
say 1904, 37 trains between Champaign and Danville.
yeah.
You think about that, that's 5 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the morning. So you got 37 trains between that time frame. That's very nice, you can pretty well, pick the time you want to go.
Can you envision anything like this in the future for our communities, or is it just not a practicality?
I don't
I don't think the economics are there anymore. I mean, barely for passenger trains. I mean,
But
Amtrak
the-
can't survive.
The interesting thing, they say that in life, everything makes a full circle. Well, here you got this railroad that built a railroad, they banned it, but now they're converting them to bike trails. But then I've also been told that there's what they call rail banks. It's for the future, someplace in the part of the future, they might come back and actually put a railroad back down on that stretch of what was a hiking trail, will become railroad again, but it'll be electric, like your St. Louis,
like a light rail system.
yeah, like rail system.
Absolutely.
So, technology may change enough that, of course, everybody's going green, so that might be a possibility.
Well, and if you do want to actually ride an Illinois traction car, you can still do it. I went up,
Yes.
I got a chance to go up to the Illinois Railway Museum in Union as we were working on the research for this project. You can see a whole bunch. I think they have 8 different cars. They have his office car. They've got a sleeper car. It's in pretty rough shape. The Peoria, it's in pretty rough shape, but you can still see it. And they got 101, which is one of the commuter trails between Alton and St. Louis, and they even let me drive that one, which was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and you get to open it up. They've got a stretch that 2 mile, 3 mile stretch. I don't know how
It's
far it is.
7 miles.
Oh, 7 miles, and they you get out there, and they do excursions all the time. They don't bring the orange ones out too often because they're wood, but they do special weekends. So I would encourage you to look on their website
Yes.
and go up and visit them. They have a phenomenal. It's the largest rail museum in the country, I think, is their distinction.
It's not big.
So it's up in Union, Illinois. It's a little bit of a drive, but it's certainly worth visiting. I did want to mention real quickly, Carol, thanks for watching from Sydney. She just wanted to say that her mother lived 2 miles north of Homer, and her fare was 5 cents to ride into Homer to school. So you asked about price, 5 cents for her to take the interurban to school, and that wouldn't have been odd. That a kid would have gotten on and ridden into town. I mean, think about that.
And of course, the conductor knew everybody
Oh, sure.
on that train, so they would make sure that kid got off the right place.
Dale, there's lots of compliments about your expert knowledge on the subject.
Thank you.
Those are the questions I see. Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Do we think that McKinley Avenue in Champaign was named after him?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, there's.
Mr. Kinley, and then there's the banker, it's Mattis.
Oh, yeah, George Mattis, which was his secretary
And
and family member. Yeah.
And family member, yes.
I don't know that I told you this, that we recently were in touch with Congressman Springer's daughter. They live out in Virginia, the state of Virginia, and they have, their family-wise, Senator Springer, George Mattis, McKinley was her uncle, and she has donated, I'll have to show them to you before you leave, she's donated a series of correspondence and letters from the Mattises, from the McKinleys, and I think they're donating a sterling silver tea set that he used in his Washington, D.C. residence during his time as
You
senator.
know, and they up there, his private business car is up there, and that they run it, that consists, they have a passenger motor, a trailer, and a business car, it's a three-car train set. So they do run that certain times of the year too.
It's got like a table. It's got kind of like a table you could use as a board table. It's got china cabinets with the glassware in it. It's really, for the day, that would have been
That's neat.
top notch. And just on the McKinley side, obviously you touched on a number of things that's named after him. And you mentioned in there the Christmas, there's an amount that was put in his will. $50 that goes to the wife of every minister in Champaign, Urbana, and I can confirm that they still get that check. My father-in-law, who's on the board at the First Baptist Church, that's now in Savoy, every year they get a letter from Bank of America, who still holds that money. I would like to know what the principal is. It was every church that was in existence when he died in Champaign-Urbana, and they still receive, any minister or associate minister, their wives receive $50 for Christmas. I mean, there's a ton of great stories about his philanthropy, all of the institutions he built here in town. Almost all of them are still here, and he named them, while they might be named McKinley, most of them are actually named for his parents, Hannah and George McKinley. He named McKinley Presbyterian Church is named for his mother. Of course, his father was a Presbyterian minister at First United Methodist Church, First Presbyterian Church. And there's a window inside that church that's dedicated to him. Of course, he put the money up for the whole foundation. I think McKinley Health Center is technically like Hannah McKinley. So he liked to put his parents' names on things.
And the YMCA was formerly a residence?
It was Philippi Mansion.
Part of it
Yeah.
was a residence.
And then the money that he donated to create that YMCA, the YMCA building that was Coble Hall now, on Wright Street, that building's about to be torn down. That was actually the building that he donated, and that was an original YMCA. I think I got my stories right. And then they built it over here. Now there's, of course, still one on Wright Street, but anyway, so.
One thing, too, is kind of plug Vermont Track Society. In 2006, I wrote a book about the Illinois Terminal. And there's a complete history, and the book weighed 4 pounds. But unfortunately, it got sold out.
There's a copy in our library, so if you do want to see it, you can come take a look at it in our library, but it's a terrific book. I have it at home. I have my own copy, and it's...
Well, back in the 70s, I'm always curious about the Illinois Terminal, and of course, doing research and writing for articles. And I would sit down with these old timers and I started asking questions. Why did you do this? Why did this happen? Things like this. And it got so much stuff coming in that I had to start tape recording. So I had 22 people from different crafts, different eras. And so I ended up putting together, I call it the obscure history of the Illinois Terminal, of 495 pages on a CD of just information. But the byproduct of this was all the stories they tell. They would go along talking about something. Oh yeah, let me tell you about this. And my favorite story is, you've seen this seat locomotive that's got the platform out front. Well, the headlight sits on a bracket, and it's got the wires attached to it. And what they could do, they could pick the headlight up, unplug it, and take it to the other end of the car for reverse direction. Well, Ollie was the motorman, and he had the habit of going to siding and go to sleep. Well, the conductor kind of undercut us. Ray Reed was just a new kid. Brakeman hired out. He said, "You get behind Dolly. I want you to grab those big overall straps and hang on to them real tight." Okay. He goes down the platform, takes the headlight, takes all the bracket, turns around, shines in the window, they're gonna hit us, gonna hit us! And Ray said, I was pulling back in. But this book I wrote is a compilation of all these different stories of these different people, so that's.
And I would encourage you to go downstairs and buy that book and support Dale and support the Traction Society and become a member. Their periodical that they publish is just top notch, and we have back copies in our library as well. But it's a great it's a great publication. They're doing terrific work to keep this institution alive.
Well, this book is all the money goes to the society. I'm like Mr. McKinley. I enjoy doing what I'm doing, but the money's not ready to pay. But as much as I enjoy the research and writing and get to share the opportunity to share the history.
Yeah. Well, we're so fortunate to have you here, and we're fortunate to have had you as such a key player on our exhibit. And I have to, so there was not sound when I did my intro because we were having some sound issues. So I'm going to say a little bit as a closing. I want to thank everybody who was here in person. This was the first one we've had back in person since COVID, and so we're very excited to get our History Talks series back up and running. I think we have topics all the way through December, and we're going to get those on our website. You can look at any back History Talk we've done on our website, champaigncountyhistory.org. But a reminder also, this is our 50th anniversary year. We're so excited about that. We were just named Small Museum of the Year by the Illinois Association of Museums, so there's some terrific things happening inside the Champaign County History Museum here at the corner of First and University and the old cattle bank. And we hope that you've enjoyed what you saw tonight. We hope you'll come back, and we hope you'll become a member. Membership is our primary source for how we keep the museum going. And you can be a member for as little as $35, and you can do that right on our website. So with that, we will wrap it up tonight. Let's give Dale one more round of applause. And I assume maybe you'll stick around and ask a few questions if people have some follow-up questions. I want to show you some of that McKinley stuff, and I'll stay for a little bit if you haven't had a chance to go down and look at the exhibit downstairs. Have we closed it up yet? Have we turned it off?
It's not closed.
Okay,
I
so
left it in case people want.
great. So if you do want to go down and check that out, we invite you to do that. And once again, thank you so much for coming, and look forward to next month's History Talk. Take care.